The keys felt heavier than usual as I turned them in the lock of what had been my sanctuary for the past 8 years. The four-bedroom colonial on Maple Street wasn't just a house, it was my achievement, my proof that Sarah Chen, the girl who'd grown up sharing a cramped apartment with 3 siblings, had made something of herself. The mortgage payments I'd scraped together through late nights at the accounting firm, the weekends I'd spent painting walls and fixing leaky faucets, the careful budgeting that had allowed me to transform this place into a home. According to YouTube analytics, 99.3% of viewers are not subscribed. That's a huge number. By subscribing the channel that is completely free, you'll help support the channel and never miss fresh content. All of it felt like a lifetime ago now. It started innocently enough, as most betrayals do. My younger brother Marcus had called me 6 months earlier, his voice tight with desperation. "Sarah, I hate to ask this, but Jessica lost her job, and with the baby coming, we might lose the apartment. Could we maybe stay with you for just a month or two? Just until we get back on our feet?" I should have listened to the small voice in my head that whispered warnings. Marcus had always been the charmer of the family, quick with a smile and a sob story, but even quicker to disappear when things got tough. But he was family, and the spare bedrooms were just sitting empty anyway. "Of course," I'd said, already mentally clearing out my home office. Family helps family. 2 weeks later, my parents called with their own crisis. Dad's diabetes had worsened, requiring expensive treatments, and Mom couldn't work full-time while caring for him. Their retirement savings were depleted, and they faced eviction from their senior living community. "We wouldn't ask if we had anywhere else to go," Mom said, her voice breaking in a way that shattered my resolve. "Marcus mentioned you have space." So my parents moved into the master guest suite, and I convinced myself that having the house full of family was exactly what I'd always wanted. We'd have dinners together, game nights, quality time that our busy lives had never allowed before. The reality was different. Within a month, my house had transformed into something unrecognizable. Marcus and Jessica treated the living room like their personal domain, leaving takeout containers on my coffee table and letting their 2-year-old draw on my walls with crayons. My father planted himself permanently in my leather recliner, remote control in hand, declaring that at his age he deserved to watch whatever he wanted. My mother rearranged my kitchen to suit her preferences, discarding my organizational system in favor of her own. But I told myself this was temporary. I worked longer hours to afford the increased grocery bills and utility costs, quietly replacing damaged items, and biting my tongue when my sacred Sunday morning coffee ritual was interrupted by cartoons blasting at full volume. The first real crack in my patience came when I discovered Marcus had given out my address as his permanent residence and started receiving mail there. When I confronted him, he shrugged. "It's easier for job applications. Don't worry, I'll change it back once I find something." But Marcus's job search seemed to consist mainly of scrolling through his phone while sprawled on my couch. Jessica had recovered from her difficult pregnancy, but showed no interest in returning to work, claiming she needed to bond with the baby. My parents settled into a routine of doctor's appointments and television, making no mention of finding their own place. 2 months stretched into 4, then 6. My house was no longer mine in any meaningful sense. I was the ghost haunting my own home, tiptoeing around in the early mornings trying not to wake anyone, working late to avoid the chaos, and spending weekends at coffee shops or the library just to find peace. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in November. I'd been looking forward to a quiet night at home after a particularly brutal day at work. We were in the middle of tax season prep, and I'd been pulling 12-hour days. I walked through my front door to find my living room full of strangers. "Oh, hey, Sarah," Marcus called from the kitchen, where he was opening a beer, one of the expensive craft beers I kept for special occasions. "I invited some friends over for poker night. Hope you don't mind." The coffee table I'd saved for 6 months to buy was now covered with pizza boxes, beer bottles, and poker chips. Cigarette smoke hung in the air despite my strict no-smoking rule. One of Marcus's friends had his feet up on my pale blue sofa, his muddy boots leaving stains on the fabric. "Actually, I do mind," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "This is my house, and you didn't ask permission." The room went quiet. Marcus's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, but instead of apologizing, Marcus laughed, a sound that made my blood freeze. "Come on, sis. Don't be uptight. It's not like you're using the space anyway. You're never here." "I'm never here because you've taken over my entire house," I snapped, months of suppressed frustration finally breaking free. "This was supposed to be temporary. When exactly are you all planning to find your own places?" The silence that followed was deafening. My mother appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of disapproval. "Sarah Chen, I'm ashamed of you," she said in the tone that had terrified me as a child. "After everything this family has done for you, after we sacrificed to put you through college, this is how you treat us? Like we're some kind of burden? That's not—" "We raised you better than this," Dad chimed in from his permanent position in my chair. "Family takes care of family. But I guess success has made you selfish." Jessica bounced the baby on her hip, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe you'd throw out your own nephew. What kind of person does that make you?" The guilt hit like a physical blow. These were the people who had shaped me, who had attended my graduation, who had celebrated my promotion. The voices in my head started their familiar chorus. "Maybe they're right. Maybe you are being selfish. Maybe this is what family means. Sacrifice." But as I looked around my living room, at the strangers drinking my beer, at the damage to my furniture, at the chaos that had consumed my sanctuary, something hardened inside me. "Everyone out," I said quietly. "Now." Marcus's friends gathered their things and left quickly, mumbling awkward goodbyes. But my family remained, staring at me like I was a stranger. "I need to think," I said. "We'll talk tomorrow." I retreated to my bedroom, the only space that remained partially mine, and for the first time in months, I took a hard look at my situation. I pulled out my laptop and began researching tenant rights, eviction procedures, and legal protections. What I found made my stomach sink. Because I hadn't charged rent or established formal lease agreements, my family members had established themselves as tenants with legal rights. Evicting them would require formal notice and could take months. Even worse, because they received mail at my address and had established residency, they had legitimate claims to continue living there. But it was the folder I found in Marcus's room, left carelessly on the dresser I'd moved in there for him, that truly opened my eyes. Inside were printouts of property tax records, mortgage information, and real estate valuations for my house. At the bottom was a handwritten note. "Mom says Sarah can't kick us out if we establish permanent residency. Property is probably worth $400,000 now. Could claim tenant rights if she tries anything." My hands shook as I read it. This hadn't been an emergency. It had been a calculated plan. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in 3 years and spent the day consulting with lawyers. The legal reality was stark. Getting my family out through official channels would take months and cost thousands in legal fees I couldn't afford, while also supporting 4 extra people. But I had advantages they didn't know about. I was the sole owner of the house. All utilities were in my name. And I had 8 years of meticulous financial records proving my ownership and their non-payment of expenses. More importantly, I had skills they'd underestimated. 8 years in accounting had taught me patience, attention to detail, and the power of proper documentation. If they wanted to play games with legal technicalities, I'd play to win. My plan began simply. I installed a security system, cameras in common areas, motion sensors, electronic locks that I could control remotely. I framed it as protection for the baby and my elderly parents, and they actually thanked me for being so thoughtful. Next, I began documenting everything, every mess they made, every item they damaged or consumed, every utility spike their presence caused. I photographed my house regularly, capturing the gradual destruction of my property. I kept receipts for every additional expense they caused. Most importantly, I started recording conversations. My state allowed single-party consent recording, meaning I could legally record any conversation I was part of. I invested in a high-quality digital recorder and began capturing their casual admissions of planning to stay permanently, their dismissive comments about my property rights, and their increasingly entitled demands. The recording that sealed their fate came 3 weeks later. I was in the kitchen making coffee when Marcus and Jessica came down for breakfast, not realizing I was there. "I talked to that guy at the tenant rights office," Marcus said, pouring himself cereal with milk I'd bought. "As long as we don't leave voluntarily, she can't force us out. And if she tries to make it uncomfortable, we can claim harassment." "Good," Jessica replied. "I'm tired of pretending to look for apartments. This place is way nicer than anything we could afford, and Sarah makes enough to cover everything." "Mom thinks we should push her to add us to the deed," Marcus continued. "You know, for family financial planning. Once our names are on it, she can't touch us." I kept perfectly still, hardly breathing, as they discussed their long-term plans for my property. They talked about converting the basement into a rental unit for additional income, about how they'd eventually pressure me to move out since I was, obviously miserable, living with family. The final straw came when Dad suggested they could claim elder abuse if I tried to force him and Mom out, since moving would be detrimental to his health condition. That evening, I had another conversation with my lawyer. Armed with weeks of documentation and recordings, the legal picture had changed dramatically. We now had clear evidence of fraud, trespassing, and conspiracy to steal property. More importantly, we had proof that their original claims of emergency were fabricated. But legal action would still take time I didn't have. My mental health was deteriorating, my work performance was suffering, and my savings were nearly depleted from supporting 4 additional people. I needed a faster solution. The opportunity came when my family announced they were taking a weekend trip to visit my aunt in Chicago. They'd leave Friday morning and return Sunday evening, giving me nearly 3 full days. I took Friday off work and got to work immediately. First, I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house changed. Then I called a moving company that specialized in emergency relocations. While they began boxing up my family's belongings, I worked with my lawyer to prepare formal eviction notices, cease and desist letters, and trespassing warnings. The most satisfying part was the itemized bill I prepared, documenting every expense they'd caused over 6 months: utilities, groceries, property damage, replacement items, increased insurance premiums, and even the security system I'd installed because of them. The total came to $18,847. I had their belongings moved to a storage unit I'd rented in their names, with the first month prepaid. I left the storage unit information, along with legal notice of eviction and my itemized bill, on the kitchen counter. Then I activated my security system and called my lawyer to confirm everything was in place. When they returned Sunday evening to find themselves locked out, the explosion was immediate. My phone rang nonstop with calls I didn't answer. Marcus pounded on the door, screaming about illegal eviction. Mom wailed about her ungrateful daughter while Dad threatened to call the police. Jessica stood on my lawn crying, holding the baby who was picking up on the chaos and wailing too. I watched it all through my security cameras from the coffee shop down the street, documenting their behavior as they threatened property damage and harassment. Each threat would strengthen my legal case if needed. The police did come, called by concerned neighbors who reported the disturbance. But when the officers reviewed my documentation and spoke with my lawyer over the phone, they informed my family that this was a civil matter. They were trespassing on private property and needed to leave. The next few weeks brought escalating attempts at retaliation. They showed up at my workplace, causing such a scene that security had to escort them out. They called everyone in our extended family, spinning stories about my cruelty and heartlessness. They posted on social media about my betrayal, painting themselves as victims of family greed. But I'd prepared for this too. I sent carefully selected evidence to key family members, recordings of their admissions, photos of property damage, documentation of their deception. The family members who mattered, the ones whose opinions I actually respected, quickly understood the truth. My Aunt Helen, the family matriarch whose opinion carried weight, called me personally after receiving my documentation package. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "What they did wasn't family emergency. It was fraud. You were more than generous, and they took advantage of your kindness." The tide of family opinion began to shift. Cousins who had initially sided with my parents started reaching out with apologies and support. The truth has a way of emerging, especially when it's thoroughly documented. Marcus found a job within 2 weeks. Apparently, unemployment hadn't been as unavoidable as he'd claimed. Jessica started working part-time. My parents swallowed their pride and moved into a modest senior apartment, funded partly by county assistance they'd been too proud to apply for earlier. The most gratifying moment came 3 months later, when Marcus called to ask if they could retrieve some items they'd forgotten. His tone was subdued, apologetic even. "I know you probably won't forgive us," he said, "but I wanted you to know that we found a nice place. 2 bedrooms, reasonable rent. We're doing okay." "I'm glad to hear that," I replied, meaning it. Family should take care of themselves first before they can take care of each other. There was a long pause. Then, "We handled this all wrong, didn't we?" "Yes, you did." Another pause. Will we ever be okay again? As a family?" I looked around my house again, finally, at the repaired walls and replaced furniture, at the peace I'd fought so hard to reclaim. "Maybe," I said, "but it'll never be like it was before." Trust, once broken, doesn't just heal because we share DNA. The truth was, I felt relief more than anger now. The family I'd idealized hadn't really existed. It had been built on expectations of unconditional giving on my part and endless taking on theirs. The real revelation wasn't their betrayal. It was my own strength in refusing to accept it. My house became mine again, but more than that, my life became mine again. I learned to say no without guilt, to set boundaries without apology, and to distinguish between family obligation and family exploitation. 6 months later, I hosted Thanksgiving dinner for the first time since the eviction. My Aunt Helen came, along with 2 cousins and their families, people who understood that love and respect flow both ways. Marcus and Jessica were invited but declined, still too proud or embarrassed to face me. My parents came for dessert, a careful compromise that acknowledged our relationship while respecting my boundaries. It wasn't the big family gathering I'd once dreamed of, but it was honest, real, built on mutual respect rather than manipulation. As I watched my young cousin help her mother clear dishes while her husband entertained their toddler, I realized something profound. This was what family actually looked like: people who contributed, who respected boundaries, who saw generosity as a gift to be treasured rather than a weakness to be exploited. The last guests left around 10, and I found myself alone in my house for the first time in almost a year. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility. I poured myself a glass of wine, sat in my reclaimed living room, and opened the real estate listings I'd been browsing. My 4-bedroom house was too big for one person, and I'd learned I preferred quality over quantity in both possessions and relationships. A cozy 2-bedroom cottage had caught my eye, with a garden and a reading nook and space for the people who truly mattered. But that decision could wait. Tonight, I was content to sit in my recovered sanctuary, surrounded by my own choices, my own peace, my own hard-won wisdom. I'd learned that sometimes the greatest act of love, for others and for yourself, is refusing to enable someone else's destructive behavior. The keys to my house felt light in my hand now, no longer weighted with obligation and guilt. They were mine, earned through work and sacrifice, and the courage to stand up for myself when it mattered most. Outside, snow began to fall, dusting the windows of the house that was truly, finally, completely mine again. And for the first time in months, I slept deeply through the night, dreaming of fresh starts and second chances, of boundaries respected and lessons learned, of a future built on my own terms. The revenge I'd planned had transformed into something better: reclamation. Not just of my property, but of my self-respect, my autonomy, and my understanding of what family really means. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying your enemies, it's refusing to let them destroy you.